want to welcome you to one of the most remarkable journeys you will ever take. Come and join me as we walk the corridors of the mythological dragons and beasts of St. John's Revelation. During the 3rd century after the crucifixion of Christ, the powerful bishops and Arians came into debate on the floor of Constantinople under the guardianship of Constantine. Constantine was a Christian king, and he wanted a nation that was not divided. Thus, at the end of the debate, the Arians lost and their work was relegated to the Dark Ages. The bishops, however, knowing that humanity was illiterate, that they thought the world was the center of the universe, felt that the secret teachings of Christianity could not be given. To quote one of the early bishops, it would be like giving a weapon into the hands of a child. Among these secret teachings was the mysteries of St. John's Revelation. A new age has dawned now, and for the first time in the history of the manuscript, every single symbol will be broken and every mystery will be revealed to you. I am your hostess, Elizabeth MacDonald-Burrows. Welcome. It's wonderful to be back with you for another episode of Odyssey of the Apocalypse. We are getting near to the end. There will be 4 more weeks to this series and we will complete the book. And I'm very glad about that, but I will not be leaving you so soon because we're going to do a 26-week episode on Moses and the secret teachings that he had during his life upon earth. I'm always caught with the cosmogony of Moses and how it blends in so much to mystic Christianity and of course certainly to the apocalypse itself. So much of the symbolism that John uses in the Apocalypse is based upon what we would call Mosaic or the order of Moses. Like, for instance, Moses decorated the tabernacle with blue curtains, red curtains, and purple. Blue because he used that to signify earth, red because of sacrifice, and of course certainly the 2 colors blended represented the color of ascension. He was a great and powerful man. Most people look at him as having been perhaps a spiritual failure because he was not allowed to enter the Promised Land. Many people believe him to be not a complete failure in that sense, but that he was restricted by God because he had married the Ethiopian woman and because he had sinned and he had killed someone. This is done through eyes which do not understand the spiritual nature of mastership. Moses was a great master. He was not Jewish, of course, he was Hebrew, and he did illumine on Mount Sinai. And during his years of journey through the desert lands, he completed the resurrection of the dead to become a great and powerful master. His was not to enter the Promised Land, but to take the people to the Promised Land. This he did successfully. We have been blessed with a writing that I have mentioned before on my other shows called The Hebraic Tongue Restored. This is the original Hebrew of Moses, or at least in his native tongue. It was translated by another illumined person. And when we speak of illumined, we're talking about those who have reached that divine birth of the indwelling Christ and have merged in oneness with God to have completed this remarkable transformation that we've been talking about for so many weeks. So the author of the Cosmogony of Moses, which restored some of the original and ancient Hebrew writings, was Fabre d'Olivet. And he left a great work behind him. And I just was perusing the Cosmogony, going to the 7th day, as it was translated out of Hebrew by Olivet. When Moses is writing, which of course he wrote about the 7 epochs of creation. That was one of the great masterpieces that he left for mankind, as well as laying the groundwork for what would later become the supreme courts of the land. When we read in Genesis 2, he fulfilled, he, the God, in the light manifestation, the 7th, the sovereign work which he had performed, and he restored himself in the light manifestation of the 7th from the whole sovereign work which he had performed. That sounds, as you well know, quite different. And King James Version, which said on the 7th day that God rested. He fulfilled, he the gods, the light manifestation of the 7th, and he restored himself, meaning that the God would come forth in all mankind in the 7th epoch of creation. And I think that ties in perfectly with what we're studying at this time. I trust that you've brought your King James Version and perhaps even your Apocrypha New Testament, if you have one, and your trusty old dictionary. And if you don't have it with you today, it isn't that you'll need it, but you do need to have a trusty dictionary at your fingertips. We left off with the magnificent beauty of the soul as being attired to become the bride of the indwelling Christ, or the bride of the Lamb. And as we left off, it said that, and he was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. And if I remember right, we're probably on chapter 19 at this time, which was called the Prince of Peace. And this is a chapter in which the Lord of Lords is going to come riding his horse with his army all in white in order to fight that final and last battle of the soul, or for the soul, as he sticks his mighty sword into self-will and the ego, the dragon and the beast as they lay on the battlefield. I think in our last episode we painted a rather vivid picture of this. So we are now on verse number 9. And he said, "Blessed to me, right are they who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said, these are the true sayings of God. So blessed is all mankind when they are called forth to develop their spiritual nature. We so often prioritize our time and our life into following the ways of matter, so unaware of this deep and wondrous mystery that rests within ourselves. And John said, I fell to my feet to worship him, and he said to me, "Do thou, do it not. I am your fellow servant, and of thy brethren that have the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." And of course, that's what Jesus came upon earth to do, was to teach the way to the resurrection, so that all mankind would have that wondrous opportunity to come forth in the greatness of themselves. He gave us a path by which, if we followed it, even if we only followed 2 of his rules, which is, of course, love God and love each other, we would find that very magic path that leads upward to the stars and toward oneness with God. And so the angel that has appeared to John is saying, "Look, do not fall at your feet, because I am your fellow servant. I too have passed through this." And of course, if he's angelic, then of course he has passed through the resurrection of the dead sometime long before you and I. And he said he had the testimony of Jesus, meaning therefore that he had the teachings of Jesus, which was in reality the spirit of prophecy. I don't know how many of you are aware that Jesus did the original apocalypse. It seemed that after he was crucified, several of his disciples did an apocalypse. We talked about the apocalypse of Peter, the apocalypse of Paul, as well as the apocalypse of John. And we had the revelation of Stephen. And as a result of this, Jesus is talking to his disciples as he is preparing for his final days upon earth. And he is telling them all of the things that are to come. And certainly, his prophecies have lived to fulfill themselves. And I entered, and I saw a heaven open. This means John entered into that cosmic state of consciousness. Because whenever we're in meditation, contemplation, or seeking for infinite knowledge, it is possible just by our consciousness alone to climb this remarkable ladder into the fusion of our mind with the mind of God. So he has reached this ascended state, and that's where he beheld the white horse. And he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he does judge and make war. So the indwelling Christ now has come upon the white horse, which is the illumined mind. Remember, we have talked about that horse has long symbolized the mind. And certainly in Christianity, it has been one of the great symbols. In fact, even the Pegasus and the unicorn are symbols of the mind, although they exist prior to Christianity. We find references to the unicorn in certainly the Psalms of David. But the unicorn, as you know, is a white horse, meaning a purified mind. And he has the long golden horn. And of course, what he does is pierce his horn into the heart of mortality, or the mortal human being. And the mortal human being, now mortally wounded, dies of mortality to be born anew. White represents illumination. Gold, the golden horn, represents wisdom. And when the consciousness of mankind has been pierced by wisdom, then the remarkable transformational change takes place. Then our next, of course, our next horse, like the Pegasus, again is a white horse, but winged, representing the transcendency of the illumined mind to rise beyond the lower mind and the corporeal senses, to fly in heaven among the stars. Of course, these are allegorical symbols. And in a sense, the one we're looking at now is also, because here he comes riding a white horse. He rides on the illumined mind. And, of course, he is called Faithful and True and in righteousness, because he is the one that judges. Unto him has been given all power of God to judge the soul, to see what the soul has learned, what it hasn't learned, to work out anything that it may owe another. In other words, to work out perfect atonement so that he can take the soul purified as his bride. So his eyes are a flame of fire, and that means he sees everything, and in seeing he purifies. So whenever we talk about fire, and we've mentioned this throughout, all the way through Odyssey, when we mention fire, it means purification. So what he sees as he looks deep into the soul is he purifies it, shows the soul what it has yet to do. And on his head were many crowns, because by this time we have worked our way through victory over the senses, victory over the mind, and now we're at the very pinnacle of completing the victory over the subconscious regions of the soul. So he wears many crowns because he has already won many victories. And it said he had a name written which no man knew but he himself. And I don't know how many people realize that the word Christ is not the name of a man, but it is a word used for anointed. So it would be Jesus the anointed or the illumined. So when he comes, he has, it says, a name written on him. The old name of ancient times was of course called Christos, or meaning the Christ, upon his vestry. I've written a footnote here to perhaps go one step further with this. Said there has long been an argument over which came first, sound or word or light. And this may not seem to be answering the question about the name upon him, but ultimately it does. Because he comes forth as light, but it is also sound, because as soon as light began, the vibrational frequency, which we call sound, also began. The East would say sound, and the West would say light. Both came into being simultaneously. Therefore, there can be no creation without both light of consciousness and vibration. For God is not a deity possessing a mouth which speaks words. He is both the unmanifested and the manifested aspect of over 100 billion galaxies. In other words, God is all around us as the unmanifested. He is the space between the stars. But then there's that manifested part of him, which is the stars, and that part of him which dwells in you and I. Since he manifests both light and sound, he can best be summed up by the singular Old Testament word called law, which denotes neither male nor female. It denotes neither light nor sound, but simply that one law, which is the manifestation of the divine plan. For this reason, the ancient mysteries depict the Son of God as light of consciousness and the divine counterpart of the soul, abiding in all life, meaning that which is the divine, the indwelling Christ, is that of the light of God, which dwells within the soul. Called the Son only because we only have a part of it and not the whole. And only through that part of it can we experience the whole. Thus the Greek word Christos, Christ, meaning anointed, would be the most applicable. But there are other names: Adonai, Lord, Jehovah, Elohim, Yahweh, have also been used in this context by various sects. So I'm going with the word Christos, or Christ, the anointed. And he was clothed with vestures dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. So he was clothed with vestures dripped in blood, meaning the sacrifice that he made in the beginning of creation to become us, to dwell in us, and to walk through the million years of corporeal matter. Now he has sacrificed the earthly abode, has won his victory over so many levels, or has helped the soul win victory over so many levels, that his vestures drip in blood from the battle of sacrifice. And of course, Christos, revelation of all mysteries, the firstborn, the Word of God, the light. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in white linen, white and clean. And this represents all the souls who have already passed through the resurrection of the dead, who are of the anointed and the illumined mind, form a part of the army of angelic beings that will remain a part of that army till every man, woman, and child of earth has joined the great army in the sky. I often refer to it as the great ball team in the sky. People ask me sometimes, what is your dream, or what is your aspiration or your hope? And my answer to that is, I just want to develop enough, well enough, and do things good, that I might be able to play on the big ball team in the sky. In other words, be able to work along with the workers there that are helping mankind. Out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, and we know what that is. That's that two-edged sword that we found in the beginning of Revelation. One side is truth and one is justice. And if we will forever stand upon truth and justice, no one can ever defeat us. Its power is stronger than the most powerful lie which has ever been spoken. So out of his mouth goes truth and justice. That he should smite the nations, meaning to present nations over all the world with truth. And that truth, of course, is the same in all nations, regardless of what outer form or master each nation may follow. That master has always reflected the Word of God, so that word is always the same. We're back to a statement I think I've made once or twice on television, and that is, there's an old saying that one of my great teachers said, and that is, if you put all the teachers together, great teachers together in a room, they'd agree on every major point. Put their disciples together, and they'll agree on nothing. So he shall rule, and that he might smite the nations, or give the truth to the nations, and smite that of darkness and ignorance and unknowing. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, because divine will is inflexible. Divine will is the movement of cosmic order. To be in harmony with it is peace. To be out of harmony is war. And he tread upon the winepress of the fierceness and the wrath of the Almighty God. We've talked about this too, that the winepress, it's putting grapes into a great press. And in the old days, they would get in with their feet and they would press it, and out would come this fine wine. So now all of the impurities of the soul are in this winepress. And so he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrathness of the Almighty. And he hath upon his vestures, in his thigh, a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Thigh is very interesting, because in the ancient times it was customary that when you made an oath or a vow, you would place your hand upon your right thigh. And we've talked about this also, that the thigh or the right side represents the thigh of righteousness. So thus to place the hand upon the thigh and to give an oath was so powerful. What I'm saying is that there is no oath that you can make that is supposed to be more lawful than that of placing your hand upon your right thigh and creating this oath. It's an oath that you would never break, even at the cost of your life. We break many of them in Western world, or probably all over the world in modern time, but it was not so in the old times. So and so he on his right thigh, a name written that means King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And of course, there's no name that stands out again as much as the word Christ or Christos. And I saw an angel standing in the sun, and the sun is the manifestation of the law upon earth. By looking at the sun, we see the most perfect reflection of God that is visible to the human eye. From suns are born planets, but the suns themselves are that first manifestation of light through the dark abyss, the beginning of the universe of consciousness. So it comes out of the sun, comes out of the great light, and he cried in a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves unto the supper of the great God. we know the feast. There are two great feasts in the Christian mysteries. The first one, of course, is the Feast of the Christing. And this comes when we have raised that divine spark, the indwelling Christ, and have fused in that cosmic consciousness, and this great knowledge of truth flows through us. The Great Supper is known as the Feast of the Passover. Passover from human to divine, and is equated to our Christian mysteries, or rather the Easter mysteries, rather than the Christmas mysteries. So this is to the Great Supper. This is the Feast of the Passover. Passover from human to divine. It doesn't have that, it isn't that much different than what the Feast of the Christing is, except that the Passover is more of a completion, and the Christing, or the great feast of the Christ, that is more an awakening. I wrote a footnote here based on some research work I did on this that you might be interested in. Gravitation is the law of the world of finite matter, and its impulse toward the ways of human life. Levitation, on the other hand, is the law of the spiritual world, and creates an impulse toward spiritual things. Since a bird is capable of neutralizing gravity, it is considered to partake of a nature superior than other terrestrial. In other words, the birds are thought to be more ethereal than what the animals and fish of earth would be. And thus angels have been illustrated with wings, showing, of course, a human who has transcended the corporeal nature, has been illustrated with wings like birds because they represent a soul which has transcended worldly attachments to inhabit the middle kingdom between God and human. For this reason, John uses birds in the Revelation of 19:17 to indicate messengers of God who would destroy and eat the remaining impure aspects of the corporeal nature during the last and final battle. I know what you're asking yourself. You're saying, doesn't this battle ever end? Well, the soul has been arrayed now, remember, in the bridal garments to come to the union of the indwelling Christ. But the beast is not yet dead. The beast and the dragon are still on the battlefield. They have been greatly weakened, and they have been mortally wounded. If we can say mortally wounded means they're dying, but they are not quite dead. So it means that now the soul has risen beyond this lesser nature, has done much to free itself from all of the corporeal things that are harmful to it. But it hasn't come into oneness, hasn't come into the unity state yet. So the carcasses of the beast, the residual of the mind and all these things, kind of lay at the feet of the soul, not quite dead, not to die until the final piercing of the sword, or the final union of the bride and the groom, or the soul and the inner Christ. So that's why we find ourselves here. So the birds are sent as messengers of God to start feeding upon the carcasses and the remaining residuals of this and dispose of it. It said that you may eat the flesh of kings and the flesh of captains and the flesh of mighty men and the flesh of horses and of them that sit on them and the flesh of all men, both free and bond and both small and great. So anything that we have had that has been power, which has been violation of materiality, which has been abuse or misuse of our minds, because it talks about the flesh of horses, again the mind and those that sit on them. And this is not talking about divine mind, but talking about the corporeal mind, that part of the mind which has to live in the world of matter in order to survive. So if we were to go to the more beautiful way that John would present it to the world of today, it said that you may consume the worldly ways of kings and destroy the remaining aspects of corporeality which binds the soul to matter, the impure thoughts, the impure mind, which is ruled over the corporeal senses, and all the remaining attachments to worldly enticement in both overseer and slave, small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of earth and their army gather together to make war against him who sat upon the horse and against his army. So right toward that final union, it's like the lower forces gather together, like the ego and self-will, kind of gather the last remnants of the army for one last little battle. I'm not so sure it's so little, but nevertheless, for one last battle. Because remember, they're both dying. And so there isn't a lot of strength in them anymore. And of course, the great news was, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet, so the ego and self-will, and you remember that the false prophet was self-will, which has led us astray by believing things, by believing that perhaps the things of corporeal senses was better for us than the things of spiritual senses. So that deceived him, that had received the mark of the beast, and the mark of the beast, of course, is 666, the body, soul, and spirit, bound to the corporeal world with a black mark, meaning darkness, unknowingness, unawakened. And them that had received the mark of the beast and them that worshipped his image, these were both cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. I love that scene. Of course, fire is purifying or purification. So here, finally, at last, they're taking the last remnants of this and finishing the purification. And the remnant were slain with a sword. That's good to know, that the soul will always rise victorious, that even in the last days when the wedding is imminent, and there's only that collective residual remaining, that the indwelling Christ will slay even those. The remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. Well, with that we can almost say farewell to the beast and the dragon. We enter chapter 20. Of course, battles don't end, overnight, so we have some more exciting times ahead of us. But as we enter chapter 20, I called it the second death. And I chose for a scripture to depict that chapter the best, Acts 17:24-28. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. For in him we live and move and have our being. If we live and move and have our being in God, and we surely do, then where can we go in the universe of the stars that it would not be a holy temple? Although dawn is breaking, of course I chose dawn because dawn represents, of course, new birth. Although dawn is breaking over the horizon, the battlefield is strewn with carcasses of the soul's past discretion, there is still one last mountain which rises between the scenes of war in the holy city wherein the prince shall rule. This signifies the moment of final liberation, when the last remnants of the ego and self-will are bound and chains and cast into the burning fire of dissolution. as we near chapter 20, 21, and 22, it's like listening to the final movements of Beethoven. I suppose I mention him because he really is my favorite composer. But the last movements of his ninth, which are so strong and powerful. John has kept this up, the same as someone writing a great stage play or a great symphony. He has had, as we talked about before, these times when there's a battle going on. And then there's the great crescendos of victory. And then you kind of go back into laying the groundwork so that it keeps you, the end of each chapter, as you start nearing the end of this, just gets more and more exciting, because at last you're going to get a view of the future. You're going to know that there is and will come a New Jerusalem, that earth will come to peace. And it's such a tremendous drama, and John did it so well. That's why I've always equated it, I think, to a great musical score, is because it's up and down, war, battle, victory. 20 doesn't ignore this. So we can almost sense his exaltation. And I feel that John wanted to bring to the world the beauty of this destiny that rested ahead for mankind. I feel he wanted to paint a picture of such magnificence that everyone would be touched by it, and that they would have hope in it. Because that's the way I have always felt about these last and final chapters. As the pages of chapter 20 bear witness to the final death of the soul's last vestige of ego, the symbolism becomes very complex. And so we'll be a while in the symbolism of this particular one. However, there is one area that I think we should cover perhaps before we get there, because Gog and Magog are mentioned. And of course, this comes from the book of Ezekiel, and it's Ezekiel's prophecy. And most people do not realize that Ezekiel was using the term Gog and Magog as pretty much as John is using the symbolism here. He used the names of actual places to symbolize the very same thing that John is symbolizing in Revelation. So I thought I would add this. There is one other rather complex symbol in chapter 20, which is found in verse 8. The first reference, of course, is Satan being loosed, and we'll discuss that one later. Then he goes forth to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth. And of course, four quarters, we're back to those four elements. So four quarters means, or four corners means to all of earth, because earth is imprisoned or created from the four elements. Although these cities merely reflect the self-centered nature of the ego, which has been created through the soul's temporal habitation with terrestrial world, there is an added element involved, and that is Gog and Magog. Here John refers to Ezekiel prophecy in the Old Testament, and we'll go to, if you want to make a note of this, Ezekiel 38, 11, 14, 16, 18, 39, 1. According to history, Ezekiel said Gog would invade the restored land of Israel from a far distant northern land in the last times with a powerful army of many nations. And remember that north represents death and dying. So it is natural that the army of Ezekiel, or Gog, is going to come from the land of the dying with his great army unto, of course, certainly the resurrection or new life or new birth. Gog would be destroyed by the wrathful judgment of the Lord, so the nations would know that God is Lord. And that's what we've been talking about, that the East or represents new birth and life. So the army is coming from the north, from the land of the dying, to destroy everything that is corruptible, so that all nations would know that God is Lord. While the names Gog and Magog are allegorical, Gog refers to the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and Magog referring to the land of Lydia. The battle itself refers to Ezekiel's vision of the divine destruction precipitated at the climax of the final attempt to destroy the remnant of Israel in Jerusalem and Palestine. The entire prophecy belongs to the day of the Lord, and the day of the Lord is the seventh and final epoch of creation, and includes the last revolt of the nations at the close of the mediatorial Messianic kingdom. And of course, Messianic kingdom means the time when the Messiah rides upon the soul, comes forth in the field of the soul to fight the final battle. This apocalyptic prophecy, greatly misunderstood by fundamental theologists, also refers to the coming of the Messianic kingdom and precedes the apocalypse of John by many, many years. John uses Gog in Revelation 28 to chapter 20, verse 8, to represent the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy, depicting victory of good over evil, light over darkness, and divine will over self-will. I close the introduction of this chapter with from Pythagoras, and it was translated by Thomas Stanley, who was another one of those great illumined mind of antiquity. He lived in about 1625 to 1678. He said, "But fear not thou, men of heaven so rare, taught by divine nature what to embrace, which if purified, thou all I name shall gain, and keep thy soul clear from the body's stain. In time of prayer and cleansing, eats denied or fasting, abstain from thy mind reins, let reason guide. Then stripped of flesh, up to free ether soar, a deathless God, divine, mortal, no more." What wonderful words to open to the first scriptures that appear in chapter 20. So we'll go now to verse 1. "And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hands." And this represents, the chain represents the links that we have formed throughout our journey through matter. One experience creating another experience, linking together into this long chain that represents the progression of the soul through its journey of matter. I saw an angel come down from heaven, meaning from the higher state of consciousness, because you see, when we talk about heaven, it has to be a state of consciousness, because what star, what sun, what planet out there in that 150 billion galaxies would be heaven? Heaven is a place we reach only by consciousness or by thought. So he comes down in consciousness from the heavenly estate, and he has a key which opens the deep regions of the subconscious mind, and a great chain which has been woven from our journey through matter. And he laid hold of the dragon, the old ego, the old Satan, that old serpent which is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Thus it is that when the body, soul, and spirit have returned to the unity state into oneness. And although the body is corruptible, it still has to become an instrument for the soul and the bridegroom, the indwelling Christ. So the body must manifest or serve the soul and the indwelling Christ. For this reason, it's depicted as unitive state of the body and the soul and the spirit. So as they reach oneness, the lesser nature, or Satan, the dragon part of us, is now bound. And he's cast into the bottomless pit, means, and shut him up and set a seal on him that he should deceive nations no more, till the 1,000 years be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed for a little season. So now, having been bound by the body, soul, and spirit, cast into the deep levels of the subconscious mind, he is sealed where he can no longer create any problems. So this means that he can no longer deceive the soul until oneness with the indwelling Christ is fulfilled. The soul, although the last vestiges, the soul is not yet in unitive state. But it rides herd over the last vestiges of its corporeal, of the corporeal senses. And we're talking not about the senses of sight and hearing and smelling, because we still must live upon earth. But we're talking about those things which called us into an attraction of matter, which called us or attracted us to the world of change rather than to the world of truth. So he can no longer deceive until the will or oneness with the indwelling Christ was fulfilled. And then, of course, he is released just simply for the period of atonement in order to be transmuted or changed. I made a footnote on this to better explain it. In the beginning, when the indwelling Christ descended into matter and brought the soul into consciousness, he was limited by the influence of the soul's corporeal senses and attraction to matter. Because the soul then served as intermediary between heaven and matter, that part of it enmeshed in matter became less, or the lower nature, Satan. Now through the resurrection of the dead or indwelling Christ, the soul puts away its false values and seeks unity with the divine counterpart. During this first part of the courtship, all is well. However, the temptations buried in the subconscious must still be further purified. Therefore, the indwelling Christ causes the soul to work through the lesser nature to transmute and change it in preparation for final union. In the Via Dolorosa, this phase of divine metamorphosis is known as the final phase of the resurrection, when the soul is put into the tomb and must roll away the stone, which is the last and final throes of the ego. But the rest of the dead live not again until 1,000 years. Well, wait a minute, I think I missed one here. And I saw thrones, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their forehead, or in their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ. And of course it said for 1,000 years, but that means forever. The body, soul, and spirit, having become one, would reign with the Christ unto eternity, or until the body drops away and then it's just the soul and the Christ in its heavenly estate in the garden of God. So it said that all those who had descended, and that as he saw the thrones, judgment was given to all mankind. In other words, every soul has now been judged, and whatever residual remains is also judged, so that we receive the unlearned lessons, or exactly what is given to us, or what we have done must be given back to us. And they lived and reigned and dwelled with Christ forever. But the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years was finished. And this was the first resurrection. As we are raised this divine Christ through the resurrection of the dead, it is called the first resurrection. But it will also be called the second death. The Christ died, and the soul, as it descended into matter, died of its heavenly abode to make its long journey through matter. Now it dies of the attraction for the corporeal world as it ascends to heaven, meaning the second death, but the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. For such the second death has no power. So once we have entered into the resurrection, the second death, meaning the death of the corporeal or our attraction to the corporeal world, causes us no pain. It said that it has no power. And they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years, which is, of course, as we talked about, 1,000 years is forever, because the body, soul, and spirit have all become one. And it talks about priests, that all of us, written, created in the beginning of time, have each of us within us that a small fragment of that divine plan. It is our destiny. Only you can paint the great picture of your destiny, and only I can paint the great picture of mine. For no two people have ever been created the same, nor are they woven upon the same long chains of destiny. So, but priest means holy, pure, rulers over the corporeal nature. The divine rules over the human nature. And when 1,000 years had expired, Satan will be loosed from his prison. And after they have raised the indwelling Christ through the union of the body, soul, and spirit, the iniquities of the soul will be let out of its prison for a short time. And go back to Odyssey chapter 20, verse 3:1, for further clarification of that one. And shall go out to deceive nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, and gather them together to battle. The number of them is as the sands of the sea. And so they go out to those who have led people through, during the periods of imprisonment to matter, have not always been truthful. We're not talking about those that go out to lie and to deceive intentionally, but we're talking about those who, unknowing, because they walk in darkness and ignorance, have taught those things which are not true, and they have deceived the whole world. And now all of this is going to end as they're gathered together for that final and last plunge of the great battle that takes place in Revelation. So they gathered them together, and the numbers are as the sands upon the sea. And they went up on the breadth of earth and compassed the camp of saints about in the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The purification of God comes down from the heavenly state, or the cosmic state of consciousness, and destroys the last remnants of the ego and self-will. It is well to reiterate that the holy city is not a specific location, either upon earth or in the vast universe of the stars. Rather, it is a state of consciousness which will possess mankind's future world, for it exists in all humans and is the state which has been achieved by every saint and seeker of the mystery of the resurrection who has surrendered ego and self-will. Perhaps this is one of the greatest promises of the apocalypse, that any human being can dwell in heaven while they live upon earth. I leave you with this as a reality. Jesus said, I am in this world, but I am not of it. Once the resurrection is completed, we are and will be in the world, but not of it. We will be able to commune and to talk to the angels as natural as talking to each other. We will be able to have minds that transcend all time and space, be filled with wisdom and knowledge that we never dreamed was possible. And truth shall rule over us, and we shall at last paint our great individual masterpiece upon earth. I'll be with you next week. I want to thank you for being with us during this exciting journey into St. John's Apocalypse. Jesus once said, there shall be no peace among people till there be one garden of the brotherhood over earth. So come, let you and I work together for this common cause, that the great age of mankind can come into existence. Until we meet again, peace be with you.